cell maturation in B-cell lymphocytes. And they get these recurrent staph infections, strep infections. Neisseria is another encapsulated organism. Haemophilus pneumocystis is a protozoan infection. But they get these recurrent infections, and they're usually lung infections that you really see. They get lots of recurrent pneumonias. And because they have no gamma globulin, they can't make gamma globulin. That's what they get. And IV. And this is a picture of showing you how these cells maturate. So you start out with this kind of a pro-B cell, which moves into a little bit more advanced B cell. And then this is where X-linked agamma-globulinemia or Bruton's agamma-globulinemia, this is where the defect is. These cells can't transition into an immature B cell, which then moves down into a mature B cell that makes antibody. So they have an arrest in maturation of their B cells, which is not reversible. This is another type of antibody deficiency, which is out there in the real world. That's why we said that big blue piece of pie is mostly antibody deficiencies. This is one of those in that category. Common variable immune deficiency. This is defined by a decrease in 2 out of 3 of the immunoglobulins. So either IgM, IgG, IgA. And it's a big problem is it's a B cell defect. These kids, when you immunize them, they'll have poor response to vaccines. So when we measure titers of antibody in their blood to the vaccines that we gave them, they have very low responses. And they present with recurrent ear, nose, throat, and airway infections, bronchitis, pneumonias. Not very common, anywhere from 1 to 50,000 up. I've seen up to 1 to 100,000. Has a genetic basis, and the treatment is usually prophylactic antibiotics and gamma globulin, either sub-Q or IV. And this is a picture where this is. So we know here is where you're blocked for X-linked agamma-globulinemia. So when you move down into common variable immune deficiency, their block is here. So they have these kind of pro-lymphocytes, but it's these plasma cells and memory B cells that really manufacture most of your antibody, and that their lymphocytes can't move all the way down to that last final pathway. Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome is a well-defined immune deficiency syndrome. This is on your PEDS boards when you're taking your PEDS boards. And these kids have eczema. They have a low platelet count, and this defect impacts their T cell responses and their B cell responses. When you do lab work on them, they'll have a low immunoglobulin level. If we do a skin test for Candida, you only get a little bump if your T cells work. These kids may not get the bump. It's X-linked, so it's mostly, yeah, sometimes being a guy just is a bummer. So, it's pretty rare, 4 in a million births, so not very common. Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome gene, not too hard to remember. And they have increased risk for infection because their immune system doesn't regulate well. They're at risk for autoimmune disease and for malignancy, which is actually true for quite a number of these immune deficiency disorders. And they get treated with gamma globulin. They remove their spleens and bone marrow transplant. And this is a picture of a kid with Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome. So this is what we're looking for eczema. You can see this eczematous skin rash the kid has. So if this kid came in your office, mom says, geez, he's sick all the time. He's always got this rash. You do some blood work and his platelet count is low. You have to start thinking about Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome. So ataxia telangiectasia, the other name for this used to be called Lewy-Bosc syndrome. This ataxia is a problem with the cerebellum that controls your capacity to balance yourself. So they have staggering, unsteady gaits, and they'll have in their eyes, they'll have these dilated blood vessels. They have low immunoglobulin levels, and they have abnormal T cells, so they have a harder time with infections. It's autosomal recessive. And one of the basic mechanisms is their impaired DNA repair mechanism. So in our cells, our DNA constantly breaks, and we have enzymes that live in all our cells that come through and they fix your DNA when something breaks. Theirs doesn't work very well. And one of the consequences of having bad DNA repair mechanisms is you're at increased risk for cancer, and in their cerebellum, they can't repair their cerebellum, and some of those cells die, and that's why they can't walk very well. They also have recurrent problems with sinus infections, lung infections, and they get treated with gamma globulin. And this is what telangiectasia looks like when you look in their eyeballs. You look down the weight of their eye, and you can see these big dilated vessels. And this can present as early as 5 years of age. So you have a little 5-year-old in your office who's been having problems, and you do your exam and see this. That's what you're going to be thinking about. Now, the reason I put this up there is because I will never see a case of this. I think there's been like 30 cases defined in the world. But the level of sophistication in the immunology labs now is so incredibly amazing. When I was reading about this syndrome, I go, this is amazing that somebody actually figured out what this defect is. This is a very rare defect in the innate immunity, and it's a defect in the pathogen recognition receptor signaling. The other term for it is toll-like receptors. They're little things that stick out of your cells, and something comes along that doesn't feel right. Those things get activated and turn your immune system on. It's a very unique part of our immune system. Theirs doesn't work, and they end up with these recurrent pus-forming infections, ear infections, lung infections, and they can get really sick. And this is a picture of where the problem is. Somebody actually identified, IRAK stands for interleukin receptor associated kinase. And it's a type 4 kinase, which is why the 4 is sitting up there. But somebody actually figured out that this little thing that should get triggered here should generate this enzyme, tyrosine kinase, which starts the whole pathway going to turn on your immune system to fight these infections. And there's a defect right here in this signaling pathway to generate this thing. And that's how sophisticated they've gotten with immunology since I studied this stuff in medical school and worked in a research lab. It's just amazing. And this is a patient who ended up being identified with an IRAK4 deficiency. And what do you see here? This is an air fluid level. So this is a big abscess in the lung. And this fluid is just layering here, flat across here, all filled with pus from some infection. So to conclude, immunodeficiency disorders are fairly infrequent. Some are transient and improve over time. Transient hypogammaglobulinemia associated with extreme premature birth. IgG subclass deficiencies, those are all examples of things that will get better with time. More severe forms of immune deficiency are associated with a shortened lifespan without bone marrow transplantation. And with the Human Genome Project now, a genetic cause has been identified for a substantial portion of these diseases now. And you can, they have these research labs where you can send off just about anything you need to figure something out. For the patients who do suffer from immune deficiencies, depending on the severity of their illness and which particular disease they have, they may respond to prophylactic antibiotics. The IV infusion nurses are responsible for the ones who are getting this, sub-Q gamma globulin or IV gamma globulin. Stem cell or bone marrow transplantation for kids with more severe life-threatening immune deficiencies. There are always new biologicals coming along, and there is work utilizing gene therapy to reverse some of the defects in the patients with certain disorders. So next time I talk, I'll do part 3 on this, and I'll talk about some of the diseases of immune dysregulation, which is hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, SCIDS, or severe combined immunodeficiency. These kids all get bone marrow transplant. When I was a resident, I took care of a lot of SCIDS kids because they would get referred to the big center over here for it. We'll talk about some of the T-cell disorders, some of the autoinflammatory stuff. Okay, thanks for coming. Anybody have questions?
thermoglobulins when you get the thermoglobulins? How are they used? Are they cells? Or is it
No, gamma globulin all comes from donated plasma. And what they do is they take it, first they screen everybody, and they make sure they don't have hepatitis C or HIV or malaria or some other transmissible disease. They take it out, it's a protein. Gamma globulin's a protein. So you purify out the gamma globulin portion, and then they usually end up treating it with a detergent. And the reason they do that is because on the outside chance that the patient had hepatitis or another HIV or some other infection, the detergent destroys the organism. So when you infuse the gamma globulin, it lowers the risk very close to zero that you're going to transmit a disease. I don't know how many of you have been in the IV infusion business, but you may remember about probably 15 years ago, there was a big outbreak of hepatitis C in patients getting gamma globulin. And what happened was they thought that they were adequately treating it, and they were not. And it was being transmitted through contaminated things. So that's why it's so expensive. You have to collect it from people. People sell their plasma to make it. People make money selling plasma. So.
These kids that, Roy, these kids that have the lung abscesses.
Yeah.
How many, I mean, what's the percentage of them that end up having some kind of surgical intervention?
It all depends. It all depends. Most of them, if it's a single isolated abscess, if it's a single isolated abscess and the kid responds to therapy, we just treat them with long-term antibiotics and it goes away. If it's in the periphery of the lung, right up against the chest wall, you can go in there and they'll the invasive radiologist will will poke a hole right through the chest wall, right in the abscess, and drain it externally directly out. For some of the deep abscesses where the kids are not responding to therapy, they're sick, they're febrile, they're not getting better, then those are the ones we'll go in and cut them out. But
lobectomy is? Or?
Yeah, you do a lobectomy. But most of them are small, self-limited, and you don't have to cut them out. And most abscesses are not immune deficient kids. It's just an infection with an organism, usually staph, but gram-negatives will do it too. Well, they just form an abscess, or anaerobes. Those are the three biggies. So staph, some gram-negatives, and anaerobic infections. And the most common ones I remember seeing, it was always a red flag, is you have a kid with cerebral palsy, and he went and got dental work, and he microaspirated some of the stuff that came out of his caries and stuff like that, and they get lung. That's a pretty classic description. So, but most kids with lung abscesses do not have immune deficiencies. Most do not, for sure. So, okay, good to go. Thank you. Yep.